If you've ever looked at tiny house and thought that's got to be cheaper than an apartment, you're not alone. And the internet is full of claims about ultra cheap, tiny living where you have zero bills and financial freedom. But is that actually true, or is it just really good marketing and pretty camera angles? Today we're doing a full, honest, no hype cost breakdown of tiny house living versus apartment living, the upfront costs and the monthly costs, and the hidden costs, the lifestyle costs, and the expenses nobody tells you about until you're already committed. And by the end of this video, you'll have a realistic picture of which one is actually cheaper, and more importantly, which one is cheaper for your situation. So let's get into that, all right? We'll go ahead and define two types of lifestyles. Before we talk numbers, we need to define what we're comparing. When I say, tiny house, I'm talking about 150 to 400 square feet, either on wheels or on a small foundation. Full living setup, a kitchen, a bathroom, a sleeping space, built new, bought, finished, or do-it-yourself built. When I say apartment, I'm talking about a studio or a one-bedroom rental. In an average U.S. city, not luxury, not ultra-cheap rule, market rate rent, utilities not fully included. We're comparing realistic, all right? Middle of the road scenario, not the cheapest possible and not the luxury version of it either, okay? Because yes, you can build a $15,000 tiny house, and yes, you can rent a $3,500 apartment, but most people, land somewhere in the middle of that. The upfront cost of the tiny house is a section that we also need to cover here. Let's start with the big shocker. Tiny houses often cost more upfront than people expect. Tiny house purchase prices are typical ranges anywhere from, like, a do-it-yourself build, $25,000 to $60,000, and a partially do-it-yourself build, $60,000 to $90,000, and a professionally built, $80,000 to $150,000. And and that's just the house itself. And now let's stack the real startup costs, a trailer or a foundation. And if it's on wheels, quality trailers, there's $6,000 to $12,000. And if it's on land, foundation and your prep work on your foundation can be anywhere from $8,000 to $25,000. The land costs, there's a huge variable, and there's lots of options too. You could buy land anywhere from, $10,000 to $80,000. You could lease land, $300 to $900 a month, or, you could park in backyard. Sometimes it's free and sometimes it's rent. People forget this. A tiny house still needs somewhere legal to sit though, a utility setup. If off-grid or semi-off-grid, here's the cost for that. A solar system, a solar setup, $8,000 to $20,000. The sky's the limit on that. The water system, $1,500 to $16,000 to $6,000 on average. Septic or compost toilet setups, $2,000 to $15,000. Electrical hookups, $2,000 to $8,000. Permits and zoning, depending on your location, permits can be $500 to $5,000. Site approvals, $1,000 to $7,000. You have also your delivery and setup. If you're buying a pre-built transport, it's $2,000 to $10,000 depending on where it's coming from. That's tiny house realistic upfront totals. And most real world setups land around, they land around, $55,000 to $140,000 if they're all in. And yes, some go lower, but most end up right about there. Anywhere from $55,000 to $140,000 for a decent tiny house. And that surprises a lot of people. And it's a cost that you need to take into consideration. A lot of upfront costs of an apartment. Okay, let's cover the upfront costs of that. Apartments are much more simpler upfront. The typical move-in, it costs, your first month's rent or a security deposit, usually 1 month, and application plus your background check, your pet deposit if you have a pet, and moving costs. Example, just on average, if rent is $1,400 a month, your first month's $1,400 and your deposit's $1,400. Your fees are $150. Your moving truck and supplies are $300. Your total up front could be right around $3,200. $1,500. Then even higher rent areas, most people are in for $3,000, $6,000 up front. And not just 60,000, not the 60,000 that it took to build a tiny house. And that's a massive difference in entry barrier. Monthly cost of the tiny house, let's cover that. Now, let's look at ongoing monthly costs. Deep down in tiny houses, it doesn't automatically mean tiny bills. All right, land rent, for instance, if not owned, an RV park is anywhere from $500 to $900. A tiny house community could be anywhere from $600 to $1,200. Private land lease, $300 to $800, and utilities, the grid connection per month, $50 to $100 for electric, $120 even. Water and sewer, $30 to $90. Internet, $60 to $120 on average. Depends if you have, high speed DSL or cable in the area. It really depends. Off grid, it means lower bills, but higher maintenance fund, okay? Because a lot of that stuff is very expensive and can fail just doing the normal things. Next thing is insurance, which is a very difficult topic when it comes to tiny houses. Tiny house insurance can be anywhere from $50 to $150 a month. And next, it's just like any house. You got to have a maintenance fund. Tiny houses need more frequent upkeep. Set aside $100 to $250 a month because, roof wear, your trailer wear, your moisture control, system replacements. And here's for the tiny house monthly average. If you're renting land, okay, $800 to $1,500 a month. If land is owned outright, it could be $200 to $600 a month. Land ownership is the key cost and the key swing factor here. Monthly costs for an apartment, now apartments, rent, national mid-range, is anywhere from $1,200 to $1,800 a month. Your utilities, $80 to $150, water, $40 to $90, internet, $60 to $120. Your renter's insurance is a little lower than this tiny house insurance at $15 to $30 because it's only covering your belongings. Parking or amenities, sometimes people have to pay to park on some of these issues and places that they rent. $50 to $150. Trash fees, $20 to $60. That's pretty common going down through there. Sometimes people have it rolled into their town utilities, but that's neither here nor there. But apartment monthly average is anywhere from $1,400 to $2,200 a month. And it's more in cities and less in rural areas. So the hidden costs nobody really talks about. This is where most comparisons, they just fall apart. Tiny house, hidden costs. All right. Zoning headaches. Okay. Legal battles, forced relocation, permit denials, moving costs is another one. Tiny house moves are expensive. $2,000 to $8,000 per move if it's not able to be pulled by yourself. Storage units. Many tiny dwellers rent storage at $80 to $200 a month because when they downsize, it's hard to change that whole lifestyle of not having a lot of things. Tool purchases, repairs, or do it yourself. Tools costs they add up if you don't already have them. Moisture and climate upgrades as you move around. If you plan on moving around, there's dehumidifiers, there's insulation retrofits, ventilation fixes, because, in a small building, ventilation is still key. And here's the apartment hidden costs. Rent increases, 5 to 12% yearly in many markets. All right, amenity creep, new fees added mid-lease, moving frequency. Every 1 to 3 years you're moving on average. Furniture sizing. Apartments, layouts, they change. Furniture replacements happen. Financing differences. Okay, let's talk about that also. Tiny houses, they are harder to finance. Most are, personal loans, RV loans, cash purchases. Interest rates are often higher, and apartments require no loan, no long-term debt, and just rental qualification. This affects long-term costs significantly. And here we go on to the 5-year cost comparison. Let's talk about that too. Let's do a realistic one though, okay? Tiny house example. Build setup was $95,000. Monthly average is $900, and a 5-year monthly total of $54,000. Total $149,000. Resale value after 5 years, maybe $60,000 to $80,000. So your net cost $70,000 to $90,000. Apartment examples up front, it's a low 4,000. Well, that's not low, but the monthly average of 1,650 and a 5-year total of $99,000 with no resale value. So your net cost is $99,000. Results in this example: tiny house slightly cheaper, but only if resale holds and land costs are controlled. If land rent is high, apartment may win. Lifestyle cost factors. Money isn't the only cost, all right? Tiny house lifestyle costs, there's more daily chores. There's more maintenance. There's less privacy for couples, too, because the area is smaller. Harder with kids and the weather vulnerability. Space discipline required is absolutely crucial because the space is just not that large anymore. So if you're coming from a large lifestyle to a small one, it's going to be a big jump. Apartment lifestyle costs, shared walls, less control, parking limitations because it could be parked in a specialized area where there's just not a lot of parking, or your parking is further away from the structure and you have to walk all the way there. A lot of rules and restrictions. If you're going to be renting or the town or the city may make you follow certain rules and restrictions that are not typically found in a house or a rental house. Rent instability. That goes hand in hand with local town governments and local government in general. How stable is the area in that I can rent that, the trustee won't come and say this is not allowed and to remove you. So it's really important to find that one where it's a stable place to rent. And when tiny house wins financially, let's talk about that. Tiny house is cheaper when you own the land. You do it yourself build. You stay put for 5 years and you maintain resale value. You avoid frequent moves. You avoid luxury upgrades. And let's talk about when the apartment wins financially. Apartment is cheaper when land rent is high and you move often. If you have to move often and you're able to move it on your own, that's even better. Tiny house is financed at high rate interest, all right? You overbuild tiny house. You need storage units and you live in low rent areas. And the biggest myths of them all, the biggest myth is tiny houses are always cheaper. And the truth is, tiny houses are cost efficient only when planned carefully. Otherwise, they can cost the same or more than renting. So that you have a decision framework, all right? Ask yourself, do I have a land access? How long will I stay put? Am I a do-it-yourself capable? And do I want maintenance responsibilities? Do I value mobility? And do I value ownership? Your answer decides the winner of this all. And here's the final verdict. If you want lower long-term costs, ownership, independence, stable land access, tiny house can win. And if you want low upfront costs, flexibility, or zero maintenance, and easy location, an apartment wins. Anyways, thanks for watching. Make sure you check out the video over here up on our right-hand side, and we'll catch you on the next one. And stay tiny.